Regional Consultant for the Division of Digital Teaching and Learning. And my name is Kathy Parker. So what I do is if any of you all are in the Sandhills region, I support your region, media and technology directors, in all things digital teaching and learning. I am also the school library media consultant for the Department of Public Instruction. So I support library media coordinators across the state as well. My contact information is here. Please feel free to follow up with me at any time, whether it be about funding or anything digital teaching and learning related. My contact information is here for you to follow up with. Um, Today in this session, I'm hoping that we're going to be resources for each other. I know that we're meeting virtually, but that doesn't stop us from being resources for each other. As I mentioned, we are going to be doing some interactive activities where you'll be able to share with each other. And you can also unmute yourself as well if you have information or tips related to grant writing that you think might be helpful. Since you're an educator, I know that you have a passion for education, right? We wouldn't survive in the field that we're in, especially in these crazy times that we have going on right now, if we were not passionate about teaching and learning, if we're not passionate about our students. And so I know that you are passionate about learning because you're taking your precious time to think about how you might be able to fund your instruction or fund resources for your students or fund learning opportunities for your students. And I'm hoping that you're going to be resources for each other today in that. We're going to go through and I'm going to share with you just some grant writing tips that I have gleaned from my experience. Just so you know a little bit more about my background, I was a high school English teacher for about 5 years. Then I was also a school library media coordinator for about 2 years at an elementary school and then about 10 years at a high school. So I have been a school-based educator for about 17 years. And then I've also been with the Department of Public Instruction for the last 7 years at this level. So I have written grants and been awarded grants myself when I was a school-based educator. I have also been on committees at the state level, reading grants. So from different things, experience and sessions that I've participated in myself as an educator, my independent research on grants, I have gleaned some tips that I'm going to share with you that I hope will benefit you all in your work and your students in the future. You're also going to have some opportunity to investigate some sources yourself for potential funding and data. Um, I like to be a facilitator more than a presenter. I am going to present you with information, but I'm also going to just provide you the structure and the time to interact yourself with some resources that I think may be valuable, or do your own research for potential funding sources. So that's what we're going to do for the next few minutes together, and I hope that you're going to find that it is useful. So you know a little bit about me. Now I want to take an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you. And this is just an interactive activity that I call How Do You Do? And what I'd like for you to do is in the chat, I would like for you to just post something that introduces yourself, whether it's something about your educational background, your experience, whatever you'd like to post. Take a moment and post it in the chat. And then also post if you have had experience with grants. Maybe you've been awarded a specific grant and you can tell us what it is. Or maybe there's a resource that's your go-to resource for grants that you can post there in the chat. How do you learn about grants? Take a couple minutes and just process that and post in the chat introducing yourself and something in your background related to grants if you are familiar with any of those resources or grant opportunities you want to share. And I'll be quiet for a minute. All right, Sherry, thanks for posting. I hope that you're going to learn some beneficial things that'll help you in the future with grants. And maybe the next time our paths cross, whether it be virtual or face to face when it is safer, you'll be able to share with me about your grants. Others that we have, Natalie, Edgecombe County. So we've got Vance and Edgecombe represented. Little to no experience. Great, you're in the right place, Natalie. Anyone else would like to post? All right. So Fiona, you have some experience, but you're just going to be brushing up on it. That's great. One of the things that's incredible about this time that we are in right now and the explosion in virtual teaching and learning is that we can all be together all over the state. So I love seeing where you all are from. We've got the mountains represented. We've got North Central represented. Thanks so much for joining us from Guilford County. All right, so that kind of lets us know who's in the room and gives us a little bit of background information so we can feel like we have, just a little more knowledge about each other. And this is a nice little group that we have thinking about funding sources. So I'm hoping, I know that many of you mentioned that this is, you're kind of starting it at zero here because you don't have any experience, but I'm hoping that after this you will have enough information that you can even share with others to help them with funding sources, or you might become a go-to person in your schools. You can go back and, whether it's virtual or physical, share with your colleagues some of these resources, especially since you have the URL there that Dr. Fair posted in the chat. Bookmark it on your device. Please feel free to share it out. As I mentioned earlier, this session is being recorded too, so it's my understanding that it'll be posted in Nieces and you can come back to it, or others can log in there and benefit from this session. So we'll start with thinking about grants. And one of the things that I always tell people in thinking about grants is that there are things that you need to think about up front. So I'm going to take a few minutes and go through some pre-work considerations that you might want to think about now before you even think about a grant that you want to apply for. As an educator, I'm sure that there have been times when you've requested funds from a principal, maybe it was a grade level chair, only to be told that the money was already earmarked for another initiative, or you thought maybe, if only I had the money to do X, whatever X is, for my students. But sadly, many of our programs are operating on shoestring budgets, and of course, COVID has wreaked havoc with our economy right now. So especially when the need for educational resources, whether it's for face-to-face instruction or distance learning, our need just continues to grow, it seems like. So maybe our recent remote learning experience has revealed to you that maybe there's a need for your students to have more ebooks. More digital content needs to be available because of online learning for your classroom. Maybe you've been wanting to start a maker club. I support library media coordinators, and oftentimes library media coordinators have maker spaces as part of their library media program. So maybe you've been wanting to start a maker club or a book club. Although we're meeting virtually, we have lots of virtual book clubs going on across the state. So maybe you have an idea of a project that you want to implement with your students, but you don't have the funding for it. You don't have the materials, be them print or digital, that you need, and you're not sure where the funding could come from. I could go on and on with possible needs, but regardless of what the particular need is that your students have, grants may be viable funding sources. So I want us to think about some pre-work that may be useful to us when we are thinking about grants. You really have to strategize up front and do pre-work to make your funding pursuit more successful. And if you have a little bit more, do a little bit more work on the front end, it will make applying for and implementing grants when you get them a lot easier. So there's some things you really need to think about before you start throwing things at a grant wall, just, hoping something will stick. So I want to be an upfront thought partner with you right now on this, not knowing for sure your students' needs or the projects that you have in mind, just kind of brainstorming things to ponder before you get a ways down the grant road. So something to really think about. Number one, I know that this sounds pretty straightforward and it would kind of be like, duh, but I have to say this, a lot of times I have read grants or even started reading grants and had to put them aside and stop reading them because the institution that applied for the grant wasn't even eligible. They didn't meet whatever the parameters were for the grant or special requirements for the grant. So before you even start applying for a grant, are you eligible? Is your classroom eligible? Is your school eligible? For example, if I am a media coordinator or a classroom teacher in a private school, I don't want to spend time applying for a grant that's only for public education, right? Because I'm in a private school. So I really need to know, I need to save myself some time. I need to save myself some heartbreak and make sure that whatever I'm applying for, I'm actually eligible for. Don't want to waste our time because time is so precious. As in all things, it's really important that you know and follow your district's policy regarding applying for grants. Some districts have specific protocols that you have to follow before even applying for a grant. So make sure whether you are in a charter school that you know your charter school's policy. If you are in a public school district, know what your district's policy is regarding soliciting funding through grants. Think too about, and this kind of can go with the district policy, this is something you may talk to a principal about, but make sure that you know, will you as the grant writer, if you receive the grant, will you or will the school or will the district own the materials that you receive in a grant? So for example, if you're seeking funding for your robotics club, and maybe you want spheros. So you apply for a grant or you're thinking about applying for a grant for spheros to use with your robotics club. Are you going to control those spheros? Or will the school or will the district? What happens if you transfer to another school? Will the spheros go with you or will they stay at your current school? The answer to those questions may influence your next steps. So when you're thinking about a grant, really think about that and make sure you know ahead of time if you're applying for items, materials, who will, I don't have my camera on so you can't see my air quotes, but who will air quote own those materials that you are awarded if you are awarded them in the grant. Something else to think about with pre-work is not just the stuff you want. Like, for example, if I want spheros for robotics, of course, stuff is important. The stuff is what helps our students to accomplish whatever objectives and goals we may have for them. But you really want to make sure you have a clear understanding ahead of time of what goals and objectives you want your learners to meet. Because while many grants are used to purchase stuff, the focus should be on the learners and what the stuff will do for them, so that your students it's really student centered. Your students are the focus for your grant work, not necessarily the stuff. So when you're thinking about possibly looking for a grant, what do you want? What are the goals that you have for your students? What objectives will the funds for the grants help your learners meet? Thinking about that. Some other pre-work. This is really important if your grant involves technology, or if your plan or your thinking has anything to do with technology. Have you discussed your plans with your school's or your district's technology staff? It's really important, because you don't want to devote lots of time to applying for a grant, like let's say for equipment, technology equipment, that your district technology department can't support. Like, what if you don't realize it because you're not a technician, or you're not technically minded that way? You're thinking about your content and your goals for your students. But what if what you're thinking about, the infrastructure for your district doesn't even support? Let's say you're thinking about iPads and your infrastructure doesn't support iPads for your students to use to accomplish X goal that you have for them. What if you're thinking about specific software that your district maybe it's not approved by your district, or maybe the current devices that your district supports aren't compatible with that software. You want to make sure you have that kind of information up front. So if your school has support staff like a school library media coordinator or an instructional technology facilitator, you talk to that person. If you have a technician, if there's someone at the district level that you can make sure you touch base with, but make sure you think about that if your plans involve technology. And similarly, the same thing if your plans involve curriculum support. Have you shared those plans with your C&I, your curriculum and instruction colleagues? Because they may know something that you don't that could provide you with important insight. They could also really be good partners to help you in the process if you decide to pursue a grant opportunity. And again, thinking about your district C&I colleagues, make sure that you know whatever protocol your district may have in place for you to follow. Something else to think about with pre-work is, have you shared your plans with your principal? And again, this is like one of those moments that I mentioned about whether, the very first one, whether you're even eligible for the grant. It seems like this would be obvious, but sometimes we get so focused on what our passion is, and what the goals are and objectives are and the things that we want from the funding source, and we forget our principal. And the principal is really important, because the principal needs to be on board with any plans before you pursue them. And in some cases, grant applications that I have been a part of require you to have higher level leadership approval, because the grant underwriters know that funded projects are usually more successful when there is buy-in from leadership of the organization. And of course, at a school, the leadership is your principal. So even before applying for a grant, as you're thinking about pre-work, make sure you're having these conversations with your principal. And it's also good to have at least an inkling of what data sources or assessment tools you have available. And we're going to take some time today for you to explore some possible, generic data sources that you may not know about that may be helpful to you in the future if you do apply for a grant. So oftentimes successful grant proposals contain data that demonstrates need. If you have a specific objective or goal for your students, how do you know that they need that? How do you know that they need to meet that goal, or that they don't have the materials, the resources already to meet it? You also have to, lots of times with grants, you have to analyze or evaluate the success of the grant after you implement it. So you really have to be thinking about that on the front end. Something else to kind of know about grants is that there are common educational funders for grants. There's usually kind of like 3 categories, just overall broad categories. So like government grants, they're usually very labor intensive. Oftentimes districts or the whole entity, like a school, if you're at a charter school or something, that entity would apply for a grant, but they are usually high dollar amounts for those grants, and they often require really diligent follow-up. Foundations and organizations often establish grants maybe by a specific person or for a specific person. It could be philanthropic, charitable. It could be an educational organization. For example, the North Carolina School Library Media Association has grants geared specifically for library media coordinators or other library media stakeholders like principals. Oftentimes, there are stipulations to these foundation and organization grants that align to whatever that organization's mission and values are. For example, I recall a school library media coordinator a few years ago who was in a workshop of mine, and she was awarded a substantial grant for her library. If memory serves, I want to say it was around $50,000, which is very substantial. And it was from the Jimmy Johnson Foundation. And of course, Jimmy Johnson is a famous race car driver. But that foundation specifically focused on specific geographic locations, which are important to the sponsors. I believe that was like Mecklenburg and Cabarrus counties, where of course NASCAR is pretty significant. So that's something to know about foundations and organizations. They do oftentimes have grants that can be very useful to educators, but you just want to know that a lot of times there are specifications about those grants that reflect the mission and the values of the foundation or the organization. And then we also have corporations that are a possible viable funding source for us when we're seeking grants, because corporations often underwrite grants. Now, the corporation grants you may be eligible for will really vary depending on your geographic location. So it's important for you, when you are thinking about funding sources, to know, what the local businesses are in your area and what they offer when it comes to grants. These are often easier grants to write for. Now, of course, this is just a generality. They're often less labor intensive to write, but they oftentimes too depend on building relationships with local business managers. That's really important. Maybe the local chamber of commerce in your geographic location could actually be a good resource for you. So check with your Chamber of Commerce to learn more about businesses and philanthropic people or organizations that you have in your communities that may be funders for potential future grants for you and your students. So I've been doing a lot of talking, and as I mentioned earlier, I really want to facilitate an opportunity for you all to kind of explore some potential grant sources. So I've given you ideas of pre-work that you would need to do. Now I'm going to stop talking, and I want you to do some research. On this slide, I've linked a page on my school library media website, and I know that you may not be a school library media coordinator, but most of the resources that I have on my school library media website are for a variety of school library media stakeholders. And if you're a classroom teacher, if you are a counselor, some of you mentioned what you were doing in the chat when you introduced yourself, and I saw a variety of positions. You all are all library and media stakeholders. So I think you're going to find that some of these funding sources will be applicable to you regardless of what your role is in your school. So for example, I've got a couple of resources that you might want to take a look at. So in just a minute, I'm going to cut you loose and let you do some research on your own. But for example, I have a link here to the Bright Ideas education grants. So you may decide to come back and explore this resource to just learn more about Bright Ideas. I'm sure some of you, even novices, have probably heard of Donors Choose. So I'm going to give you an opportunity if you have never explored information about Donors Choose, maybe you've just heard of it, you're going to have some time, you could choose to come back to this resource. You may want to join a professional learning community. I put a link here to Ed Webb's education funding learning community. So if you want to get notifications from them, if you want to participate in view some of the webinars that they have on funding, you may want to take this time to join that PLC. Sarah Levin, who is a media coordinator in North Carolina, has done a lot of work with funding. And this is a presentation of hers from a couple of years ago that has a link to her. She has this great grant toolkit. So you may decide to take the next few minutes to explore some of her resources. So I have a variety of resources for you linked on this page. And you have, hopefully you have opened up these slides in another tab or window so you can click on them. But I'm also going to, I guess for easier access, in just a second I will also post this link directly in the chat. So I am going to be quiet and I'm going to give you about 10 minutes just to explore, just to get click happy, look at some of the resources related to grants on this funding page, and just kind of familiarize yourself with them. So it looks like it's about 1:04 right now. Let's just say, well, to make it an easier time to remember, we're going to give you 11 minutes. So at 1:15, we are going to reconnoiter back together. So I am posting right now. Oh, nope, Carmela's already got it for me. Thank you, Dr. Fair. I appreciate that. We're going to reconnoiter at 1:15. So take the next few minutes and just click on that link and explore resources on the Library Media website related to grants. Then we'll come back together. See you in a few. Okay, I know how easy it is sometimes to get sucked into the web vortex when we start researching. So I want you to I just wanted to give you a heads up. You're going to have 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes to explore possible grant resources. Okay, let's come back together. I hope that this was an opportunity for you to just get a small taste of what may be out there. Um, I'm going to practice some setting a good example, and I even made a little note to myself to do this. Setting a good example in these times of virtual learning. It's important for us to take brain breaks when we are face-to-face and physically together with our students in a classroom, but it's even more important when we are interacting virtually. And we've been sitting here for a little while. So here's what I want to do. I want us to take a brain break so I can practice that because sometimes it's hard. We have to intentionally do that. Note that we need to stop because we've been sitting here for a minute. We need to get up and move. So I'd like for you to just kind of digest what you've looked at. I want you to get up, replenish your beverage, stretch, and then when you're ready, I want you to post in the chat something that you saw that you think might be promising or that you want to come back to and spend more time on. So we're going to take 2 minutes for a brain break before we move on to talk a little bit more about grants. And then I want you to post in the chat something that you just saw, and it might be something that you might flag for someone else. And yeah, I see the post about where the time went. It's easy to get sucked into the vortex online. So we do have to be intentional about taking a brain break. So it is 1:17 right now. Take 2 minutes. So we're going to come back together in about 2 minutes. And I'll know that it's time to come back together because I'll see that you all have posted in the chat. So I look forward to seeing what you found. So take a minute, stretch, get your beverage, and then post in the chat. Okay. Let's come back together. I see some of you posting. Several of you have posted about Webb. So I'm glad that you felt like that was useful. And I also commented on Tracy's post. That is a great resource. I use edweb.net for my own professional learning. Not just on funding sources, but they have a variety of professional learning communities that you can be a part of and regular webinars on a variety of educational topics. So that may be something you want to come back to, not just related to grants. And Fiona noted all of the information. Yes, this is just a taste. There are a lot of resources out there, so I hope that you will have an opportunity to come back and maybe focus a little bit more on one that you saw today that had potential. Thank you so much for your posts. So we've had an opportunity to talk about, think about pre-work. Now let's talk about when you actually have a grant that you are interested in applying for. So you have identified a grant that you are interested in pursuing. We want to spend a little bit of time thinking about that because I hope that after this learning experience that you will be able to find grants and you will apply for grants. Most of you all noted at the very beginning that this is your first time, you have no experience with grants at all. So I hope that this will be a springboard for you and you will be applying for some in the future. Just a caveat before I start kind of going over some recommendations that I have. Just keep in mind that I'm speaking here in generalities. So take that into consideration because I can have no idea what grants will come across your path in the future and what their specifications will be. But these are just things to kind of know in general with grants. The first thing I put up there is another one of those that you think should be a given. But oftentimes it is not. Make sure that you follow to the letter of the law. I've got my little air quotes going on here. What the formatting guidelines are. I have read grants in the past for entities where, you know, there may have been extra pages included in the grant that ended up in the vertical file, in the garbage can because maybe the grant stipulated that it needed to be double spaced and only 2 pages and the application was single spaced and was 5 pages. So it's really important to follow whatever formatting parameters the grant application includes. Oftentimes entities will not even read an application if you didn't follow the directions. So you don't want your application to end up in the either physical or digital recycling bin when you submit it and you've spent all that time writing it up. So if it's supposed to be double spaced, double space it. Just be very careful with that. If there are any other special formatting directions, be sure to follow them. Do be straightforward and succinct, if I can say that right. And, I'm a former English teacher. I mentioned that at the beginning. Please, for the love of English teachers like me, be grammatically correct. And I'll tell you why that is important. Number one, it can possibly be interpreted as a reflection of how important this grant is to you. If there are lots of typos and mistakes, will it make the grant reader think that, you just did this in a hurry and didn't put a lot of thought into it? But also it can be distracting to someone who is reading your grant, and you really want them to concentrate on your content and your purpose and the goal that you want achieved for your students. So you don't want them to be distracted by grammatical things. So make sure you're grammatically correct. Do avoid jargon. Do not use jargon. This is really hard for me because I use acronyms. I'm at DPI and I use SLMC for School Library Media Coordinator. It's just part of my, my language is to use acronyms, and I have to be really careful about that. I even have an acronym on this slide, which we drop down there, including a SMART goal. So I have to be careful with that myself, but especially in grants, because you have to remember, if you're applying for a corporate or an organization's grant, they may not be familiar with the educational jargon that you use or the acronyms that you throw out there. They may be very common for you, but if you're not in education, would they know what that acronym is, or would they know what that jargon is? Do use the language of the agency or the grant that is in your proposal. So what I mean by that is, if your grant application, if the grant application includes a rubric, if it includes specific directions about what they want to see in the grant, make sure you use that language so that a reader doesn't have to hunt for the information, so that it's really clear. You don't want them to have to search for your points that they're looking for. You want to use SMART goals for sure. That's the acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely, or either tangible. And I've put a link there if you want to learn more about SMART goals. Something to be sensitive to really is the focus on the students and the impact that you're going to have on your students. That's your end goal. So again, you may want to apply for stuff, but it's because of what the stuff can do for the students that makes the stuff important, and it makes it the means to an end. Your students are the end goal, not the stuff. So keep that in mind when you are applying for a grant. I think a do is definitely be passionate, right? From my perspective as a grant reader, it is okay, it is even welcome to read a grant where you can tell that the writer is really passionate about what they are applying for, or about what it is going to do for the learning for their students. You want grant underwriters to recognize your enthusiasm, because that can really be an indication of how successful grant implementation may be, right? If you feel if you feel like, if you feel really strongly about something, and we can kind of read that in your grant, in your writing, then as a grant reader, I might think, well, you know what, they feel so strongly about it. I know that this is going to be a grant that is implemented well because they're so passionate about it. Something you can also do if you feel it would be useful to you before applying for a grant is to consider looking, checking, or asking the funder for past successful proposals. Some entities post grant recipients' applications online for transparency and or for review. For example, like school districts can apply for the my department, my agency's Department of Public Instruction Digital Learning Initiative grants. And the recipients' applications are posted online from the past on my division's website for anyone to peruse. So it would really be sensible for prospective applicants to review some of those before applying. And I've got a link here that you can come back to just as an example. So for example, this is the acronym BAND, NC, grantees. So this was a specific grant. If I were interested in this grant in the future, I could come back and take a look at some of the projects that are posted here from recipients who were awarded this grant. It would really be sensible for me to take a look at that if I am considering applying for that grant in the future. So that's just an example that I have included. So you can see whatever grant resource you are interested in, see if they have posted past successful proposals. And if they haven't, consider, reaching out and seeing if they are available to be shared. Depending on your project or the application, you will probably need to provide a variety of student data, maybe demographic data about your student, maybe resource data, like I think about grants for library media collections. Oftentimes for those kinds of resources, a media coordinator may have to provide collection data about the resources they already have, or gaps in their collection where they may, be searching for funding to fill those gaps. If you are applying for some kind of literacy grant, then you're probably going to need to have literacy data. So you want to make sure that you support your proposal with data so that you have a convincing argument, rather than just, generalities. Another recommendation that I have is, this is just really, really important, is to have a critical friend who will read over your application. A second set of eyes finds much that could be overlooked, especially if we've been working on something for a long time. Have you ever written something or posted something online and you see that you've repeated a word like the, or of, and it's just because you have been looking at it too closely. You've been working on it so long you didn't even see it. So this is really helpful, especially if the grant application includes a rubric that will be used for scoring. So, if you know ahead of time what the rubric is, get one of your colleagues or a family member whose opinion you value to read and score your application. And that will help you make sure you have incorporated whatever the entity requires that's on that rubric. And this last recommendation is practical, but it is really important. Technology is wonderful. It allows us to meet virtually like this. And also a lot of programs now allow auto saving, right? So Word, you can automatically save while you're working. Google automatically saves for you. I don't know how many years some of you have been in education. This may be dating me a little bit, but obviously I've been in education quite a few years before auto saving was invented. And how many of you have experienced where you have been really working hard on something, you put a lot of time into it, and then all of a sudden a computer gremlin appears just out of nowhere and something happens that freezes your computer, or causes you to lose your work, or you've been furiously typing, and this happened to me one time. Oh, I learned from it. I moved my power strip out from under my desk because my foot accidentally hit the power strip and it cut off my computer. And it was before autosave, and I lost the work that I had been doing because I didn't save it recently before that happened. This has happened to me more than once. So learn from my mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others. Learn that you should consider completing the application in Google or Word ahead of time. That automatically saves your work. And this will also help you because you can copy and paste your responses when you're ready. So like if you're in the middle of doing an application electronically online and something happens, and you lose what you've done, well, you have your backup in Google or Word, and you can just copy and paste your responses when you're ready. And that could possibly save you a lot of emotional energy that you can expend on something else. Because if a glitch happened, it won't affect you because you've got your backup. So that's a recommendation that I have. So I've been talking for a while again, so I'm going to stop. Because one of my recommendations was to make sure that you have data to support your application. And of course, I have no idea what kind of data you will need for whatever grant you may possibly apply for in the future. But what I have done here is I've just kind of cold curated some data sources that I think would possibly be helpful for you to be aware of, so that once you do have a grant in mind and you need specific specifications that the grant requires, you can have this kind of in the back of your mind to come back to. I know some of you, just the word data might put you to sleep. So if you need to get up and stretch again, please do so. Take your brain break before you start looking at some data, because it is really important when it comes to grants. Of course, the data you use in your proposal, as I mentioned, is definitely going to depend on what you are applying for. But I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to ask you to just be active and participate in your own learning by taking another few minutes to explore. So let me check my time. Let's see. Yes, I think I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. That's what I gave you last time. So let's take about 10 minutes. So that would put us at about 1:45. That's good. That'll give us 5 more minutes to wrap up. So it is 1:35 right now. So I want you to just kind of get click happy. Again, Dr. Fair had posted the link to these slides in the chat. So if you need to open it back up to get to this slide on potential data sources, please do so. But let's reconnoiter at 1:45. Just take a few minutes and explore some of these data sources that are linked here. See you in a few minutes. Hey, as you are wrapping up your last 2 minutes of exploring data sources, once you finish, I want you to take a moment to reflect and process um, what we have learned in the last few minutes together and think about what your next steps are. What do you want to do from here? This, like I mentioned, this is kind of like a springboard for you. So, what's an idea that you would like funded? What is going to be your next step to try to make that happen? So, as you finish up looking at the data sources, just take a couple of minutes to reflect on that and post it in the chat. Okay, I see some of the posts that are starting now. Thank you, Natalie and Sherry. And I think, Natalie, that's definitely a need right now for books. Depending on where you are, there are various safety measures in place related to books, be they if they're print. Also, some schools do have digital collections. You may, if you're not familiar with NC Wise Owl, you may want to attend one of the NC Wise Owl sessions as part of NC Bold, because NC Wise Owl has ebooks as well. All right, my alarm clock is going off. Let me turn it off. It's reminding me that we are almost out of time. The time goes so fast. Um, so anyway, Natalie, I was saying that NC Wise Owl might be a resource for students in the future for ebooks as well. Um, Take a minute and look at what your colleagues across the state are posting. Yeah, Natalie, that's the thing with ebooks. You have to have uh, devices and internet access, don't you? So we have to be thinking about equity. So maybe that's a great idea, that maybe a grant resource will help us with equity for our students. All right, and I see Michaela's looking for hands-on materials that could go to students now. Patricia's looking for resources to help her students deal with trauma. Thank you all so much for sharing. If you haven't already, take a minute and tell me what are you getting ready to do now? So you've posted some of the things that you are interested in getting more resources for. So what is your next step? Take another minute to finish composing your thoughts if you need to. I'm practicing my wait time. See that Fiona is thinking about families and resources, training specifically for families who need assistance with technology. As educators, oftentimes our students are not just our young students, right? Our students are their parents or their grandparents or members of the community who are helping right now. All right, thank you so much for taking a moment to really reflect and think about that and share with each other what you are interested in. I hope that this has provided you kind of just an opportunity to learn a little bit more about grants and how they may be useful to you in the future. And I hope that this will be a resource for you to come back to as you are applying for grants as well. You may find some of these resources helpful. These are ones that I have used in the past and have used with this presentation. So feel free to take a look at some of those that I've listed for you as well. The last thing that I have for you, I've got to get out of presentation mode. I'm talking to myself. That's how I process things when I'm doing step by step. I have to get to this slide. So for you all to get credit for your participation credit, for those of you using the Performance Matters mobile app, you should see a QR code right now that you can scan. If you have any issues with scanning the code or issues with the app, there is also a link right down here that you can click on, and that will take you to the alternate attendance form where you can submit your information to make sure your participation in this session is noted. So make sure you take a moment to do that before you go on to your next session. And I hope that you found this information beneficial to your practice, and I hope that you have a great remainder of the day. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us. And Dr. Fair, thank you so much for facilitating with the chat and making sure everyone was able to navigate to the resources.
You're so welcome. I enjoyed your session.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.